Shortly after we purchased our Tesla Model Y long range in December 2023, I was elated with the much faster charging speeds that we were experiencing compared to our 2015 Tesla Model S, and I felt like the whole continent had just been opened up as an option, at least where there are superchargers within roughly a 200-mile radius. So I started looking around the map, thinking, what is a faraway place that we have been wanting to visit that we can go to in our new car that charges so much faster? And combined with that thought was the total solar eclipse passing through the eastern United States in April of 2024. After discussing this with my wife Jessica, we decided to drive to Key West, Florida to see the eclipse during the trip, since we would be crossing the path of totality coming from Utah. So I set to work on planning out the route as well as preparing our Model Y by putting paint protection film on the front, back, and sides. I made a series of YouTube videos about applying the PPF myself, and I'll include a link in the video description to those videos. When we go on road trips, I typically try not to overly schedule the details of the trip because I want to have flexibility to adjust the itinerary as we are going. However, I do need to roughly plan out at a high level where we'll be throughout the trip to make sure that we pace ourselves to get back home in time for me to get back to my job. And then also, sometimes there are things that we want to do that require reservations ahead of time, such as on this trip, we rode to the top of the Gateway Arch in St. Louis, Missouri, and we needed to purchase those tickets in advance because they often sell out. And more importantly than that, we went to Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky, and that park doesn't really have much to see unless you can go into one of the caves, all of which require a reservation for a ranger to guide you through, and those reservations are woefully few for how many people visit the park. When I made those reservations months in advance, it only took a couple of seconds before they were all gone for the days we were there. But luckily, I was able to make reservations for 2 different cave tours over 2 days. The purpose of this video is to outline my high-level planning of the trip, as well as the actual trip details of miles driven, states visited, national parks visited, and how much time was spent charging versus driving, etc. The next series of videos will be this trip, and aside from the first video, which is the longest drive day of the whole trip of 955 miles in a single day, I will keep the charging information to a minimum as we share our adventure with you all. I use the third-party API data aggregator called Teslafy to track all of this information automatically. And if you are interested in Teslafy, I will include a link in the video description to a 2-week free trial of it. This video is for people like me who love data, so I am just consolidating all of the high-level data into this one video. In Teslafy, under Drives, there's this option for road trips, where you can put in the start and end date and times, and then it will search for just that period of time that you can then save for as a road trip. And that's what each of these entries are down here. This is the Florida Keys trip, and it has a couple of high-level details there. And then I'll click here on the thumbnail image of it, and it will load all of the records. And this goes on for 3 weeks, so there's just hundreds and hundreds of records of each of the charges and drives of this whole trip. Here at the top, you can see there is a graph along here, which is kind of interesting. It's just showing you the state of charge of the battery throughout that road trip. Then this is the route that we actually ended up taking on this particular trip. So we came from Salt Lake, Utah area all the way over here to eastern Nebraska, visited with family and into Missouri, and then went to the Gateway Arch here in St. Louis, Missouri, looped around here into Tennessee, stayed with some friends, went up to Mammoth Cave National Park, stayed there for a couple of days, and then we came down here and camped out somewhere on this border right there, and then continuing on down the coast through Florida, stayed with family down here, went down to the Florida Keys, stayed in a hotel for a couple of nights and saw several national parks down there, and then looped around on this west side of Florida, going up past Tampa, stayed with family again, and then came across the panhandle of Florida, camped out over here on that western edge, came over here, stayed with family in Texarkana, Texas, went up here to the Hot Springs National Park, Arkansas, and back, and this also Texarkana is where we watched the eclipse from. And then from there, we pretty much just hurried on back. We did stop at another national park here at the Great Sand Dunes National Park, and then stayed with family in Grand Junction, Colorado, and then went home. Now, after that overview, let's get into some of the details of analyzing the data here. You can see that Teslafy is summarizing the data, but I did a little bit more than that. So I'm going to jump over here to the spreadsheet that I created for the high-level planning of our trip, And so just starting out, just to give you a brief summary of how this is structured, I created a column here showing each day of the trip, which, the date, and then this is the day of the week, just so I have an idea of where we are in the week when we're going to be in those locations, and then the rough agenda for that day, whether or not we're going to be just hanging out somewhere or driving long distances. And that's also aided by looking at this column here showing the number of miles that I intend to drive that day. I routed with both Google Maps and with a better route planner, just for various purposes, but a better route planner includes the charging of the card, so that's very helpful to include, and so that's where this travel time includes the charging as well. So what I would do is just create the route and then put the link of it here in this spreadsheet so that I could click on it later and quickly pull up that specific segment of the route and see the details for that day as we're doing the trip. Also, I did do a test drive with the roof box on the roof of our Model Y, driving at 65 miles an hour for a couple of miles to get a good reference consumption of 320 watt hours per mile, which is obviously higher than what the Model Y is normally expected to consume at 65 miles an hour. And so over here, I also ran the routes with just the standard Model Y profile without the roof box, just the default that comes in a better route planner, to give me an idea of how much time we're adding by bringing the roof box on the car. And ultimately, I ended up not really paying a whole lot of attention to this because we decided we needed the roof box anyway, so we just did it. And you can see the time differences are not crazy significant most of these days. Then down here, we have the planned stats. So we have planned versus actual, and you can see that I had initially planned these nights and that sometimes things changed, like family was available when they weren't going to be previously, or the weather changed so camping was more or less viable. In this case, you can see I thought we were going to camp 7 nights and we ended up only camping 4 nights. And then the hotel was supposed to be 3, but it ended up being 4. And what happened there is when we got to Trinidad, Colorado, the weather got really cold, like below freezing cold, and so we stayed in a hotel there. So that's where that changed. So overall, I thought we were going to drive around 6,600 miles, and I knew it would be probably more than that, and it ended up being 7,168. We drove in 21 different states, and some of these states we recreated in and stayed overnight, and others we just drove through briefly. So Kansas is one where we just drove through a piece of it, and Oklahoma as well. And then national parks visited. These are all of the national parks that we visited on the trip, and we're going to be sharing all of our experiences in our YouTube series coming up on going through all these parks, and that was 8 national parks total. And now this is the substantial spreadsheet that has the majority of the details in it. It's similar to the prior spreadsheet where we have each of the days of the week and the itinerary for those days, and then we get straight into the details. I'm not going to go over each of the details of each of the days, but I will go over the columns showing how much information is there, and you can look at it as I'm talking about it. So we have the total number of miles driven that day, the rated miles that were used. Now, just in case you don't know, rated miles just simply means from the manufacturer of the vehicle, they say it will consume this many watt hours per mile on average, and that's city and highway mixed. This is mostly highway driving, although some of it we are in cities, but we're always going to be using more electricity than what they are rating it to consume because we're driving at highway speeds that they're much faster. So that's why the efficiency is not 100%, right? In fact, our average efficiency was 62%. So then we have total hours of driving, minutes of driving, total minutes of driving, and I'm putting them in these different columns to help me with my calculations below down here, which we'll get into next. So then kilowatt hours used driving, watt hours per mile on average each of those days, the average temperature in Fahrenheit and Celsius, and then this is the charging information. So the number of supercharging stops, the kilowatt hours that were charged each of those days, the hours that were spent waiting for the supercharging and minutes, and then we get into the AC charging. So this is from level 2 charging when I'm using my mobile connector plugged into an electrical receptacle somewhere in the world, whether it's a campground or friend or family's home, receptacle of some sort. So then we have the time and in hours and minutes and the total there. And so keep in mind when we're AC charging, we're not waiting for that electricity, so the time spent is not really terribly relevant. But let's come back over here and look across these summary columns here. So we were on this trip for 22 days, 21 nights, that number of miles, 7,100. Rated miles used is 11,000 versus 7,000. That shows the efficiency figure of 62%. And then total hours of driving was 121 hours. And then we used a total of 2,434 kilowatt hours. So that's 2.4 megawatt hours. And just for fun, I did some calculations. Before we had solar panels on the roof of our house, the amount of electricity that we used per month on average was 584 kilowatt hours. So based on that figure, on this road trip, we used 4.17 times more electricity on this one road trip than our whole house consumes over the course of a month. And the road trip was 3 weeks, so not quite a month long either. Then, after we installed solar panels on the roof of our house, we installed a lot of solar panels, and we are motivated to use all of the electricity. So I even use the electricity to heat our house, and we have 2 electric cars now, etc. So we use a lot more electricity now than we did before we had solar, because at that time we didn't even have any electric cars, for instance. And so now we use on average 1199 kilowatt hours per month, and that's a 6-year average. And so based on that, this road trip consumed 2.03 times the amount of electricity that our whole house now consumes per month on just this one 3-week road trip. So it's just interesting to put that into scale of how much electricity electric cars use. It's a lot. But price-wise, if you look at it by the dollars, not terribly expensive depending on where you're charging it from, because the price of electricity varies dramatically if you're getting it from fast charging like a supercharger versus if you're charging at home. There's a huge cost difference there. So continuing on here, we have watt hours per mile on average for the whole trip of 339. And then keep in mind that's with the roof box on, so that this is higher than you would expect without the roof box. Average temperature was 64 and Celsius 17. And then we stopped at a total of 61 superchargers, 2.346 kilowatt hours were specifically supercharged. And then we got, and 24 hours were where we were waiting for supercharging to happen. And some of that was after I dropped off Jessica and the kids at a hotel or somewhere, friends or family. Maybe I might go to the supercharger by myself and be doing stuff on my laptop while waiting. So some of this was not as bad of waiting as other times. When the worst time that we're waiting was late at night when we were at the end of a really long travel day and the kids are still in the car and they're maybe crying or something. But that wasn't too bad. Usually they would just go to sleep in the car. How's the driving going today, girls?
Good. And also very tired.
You're very tired?
This is like the first day of our trip.
Yeah, it's a long travel day. It is. But it'll be shorter for the next couple of days. We ended up getting here at just before 10:39 p.m. How was the drive, girls?
Good.
Lucy, you fell asleep. I didn't know you were asleep. And then total AC kilowatt hours was 434 almost. And then that took 110 hours to be acquired. But once again, we're not waiting, so we don't really care how long that takes. And then here we have the total from both DC and AC charging of 2,780 kilowatt hours. Now, something to understand you might be confused about is this is the amount of electricity that was charged into the car from both supercharging and from mobile connector, like AC charging from alternating current of electrical outlet somewhere. Over here, we also have total kilowatt hours used. This is a figure that's coming from the Tesla vehicle itself of how much electricity it used according to what it reports. And so you'll notice that the number of kilowatt hours is different. We got 24 over here used and 2,700, almost 2,800 kilowatt hours were consumed from external power sources to charge the car. So the difference between that is efficiency losses as far as I'm aware. So then down here you can see that the price of supercharging, if we didn't have free supercharging, would have been $818. And that is from actual invoices. So I can jump over here to this spreadsheet and it's showing the actual invoices from Tesla that I downloaded from them. And they include the price per kilowatt hour. And in some states at that time, they were charging by the minute. And so I had to do all these calculations to make up the difference. But rest assured, I went through, did all the calculations for you. And so it would have been $818 if we didn't have free supercharging. Now, as a point of reference for the number of miles driven, if we were charging at 11 cents per kilowatt hour, like from someone's home, which is your normal everyday life, it actually only would have been $258. So I'm pointing that out to point out that if you have an electric car and you're driving it daily and charging it at home, it's actually much cheaper to own and operate than it is if you take it on a road trip and now you're charging it from DC fast chargers, whether they are Teslas or some third-party network. Actually, Teslas tend to be cheaper than a lot of other like Electrify America type networks. It'll be more expensive and more comparable to gasoline, depending on the gas mileage of the gas car that you would take, of course, instead. So now that we're past all of that data, here are some observations that I made based off of all this data and just experiencing the trip. So we spent 5 hours driving for every 1 hour supercharging. All of the above were with the 2-liter roof box on the roof, of course. The maximum length of time and miles driven in one single drive was the very first one that we did, which was 3 hours and 10 minutes and used 97% of the battery. So we'd left home with 100% and we drove 203 miles, and my average speed was 65 miles per hour, which is pretty slow considering we were on I-80. But as I will mention in that video, the kids were asleep and I wanted to just maximize the length of the drive rather than the speed, and so I just slowed down, and we ended up getting there with like 3% on the battery. And the total elevation gain was 1,600 feet, so that obviously comes into play with how the distance we were able to get. And I'm also using this as a little bit of a guideline for myself that I can drive 200 miles in this car with a full battery, virtually no buffer, and that's with the roof box on. So if you take the roof box off, then you'll have 20-30 miles of buffer probably, but that's at interstate speeds and the amount of energy consumption at that speed. So then at 11 cents per mile, the cost of supercharging is not cheaper versus efficient gas cars, but there's a lot of variables in there that it may or may not be depending on your specifics. After this trip, I had the tires rotated, and the front tires were at 7/30 seconds and the rear were at 6/30 seconds. And keep in mind, this trip started when the car only had a couple thousand miles on the odometer, and then had closer to 10,000 miles on the odometer when we got back, just as a point of reference. So I think they were pretty much close to brand new when we started the trip, and they now are like halfway worn out when we get back from the trip. Also, those tires ended up, I reported in my first year ownership review video already the details about those tires, and one of them blew out later, and they weren't the greatest tires. So I don't know that I would take much from that anecdote there. So I have some details here related to the roof box and how much I think it probably affected our efficiency. In general, I would say it was probably like, I don't know, 15% efficiency hit, but it varies dramatically depending on the wind and of course how much weight you have in it and stuff like that, and if you're going up in terrain, with a lot of extra weight. I began using full self-driving on April 1st during the trip at 5,300 miles on the odometer, and then we'd started the trip at 2,300 miles on the odometer. So by the end of the trip, we were at 9,400 miles, and so I drove 3,000 miles on the full self-driving trial, and I made a whole video about that experience and what I thought of it at that time, which, keep in mind, now in 2026, it is way better than it was at that time in early 2024. So I highly recommend it now, but at that time I did not. I will include a link in the description below to that video, just if you are curious to see my conclusions there on full self-driving at that time. So compared to a gas car, I have some details down here that I've outlined of the average price per gas at this time when we were on this trip, and then comparing it to the CRV, 27 miles versus 32. And I'm kind of glossing over this quickly because people comparing electric to gas, it's been done ad nauseum on the internet. I don't need to add a lot more to that, but I've done my own calculations here. And in general, nowadays with supercharging and DC fast charging being the price that it is, it's not always economical. It used to be, but it's not always economical to take an electric car on a road trip. But it is a fantastic driving experience, but the charging does take longer, and that's why I'm outlining all of this information to give you an idea of the specifics of how much longer does that charging take. And with young kids, it's actually a great match because they want to stop often and they want to run around and not be cooped up in the car as much. And that concludes my data from our big road trip, and at least all the data related to the car. There's one other sheet that I can show you here, and that's our expenses, but obviously keep in mind expenses can vary dramatically on the individual. And in this case, we ended up spending $1,600 and almost $18 on this total trip. And $730 of that was tours or entry fees. Accommodations was $511, that was hotels or campgrounds, which pretty much was just one campground at Mammoth Cave National Park. Food was $249. That obviously is very low. We brought some freeze-dried food with us that we had freeze-dried ourselves, and we ate that a lot in the car, and also when we were camping especially. When we stayed with friends or family, which was often, then they were usually feeding us, which is nice of them to do, and when they visit us, then we happily feed them. And so then we bought $43 of magnets, and then parking and tolls was $40. And keep in mind, some of those tolls, I've come to hate tolls because they came in months. Like 10 months later, I got a bill for $43 for additional tolls. That's just nuts. Like, you don't even know you're paying the toll necessarily. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. And they can just bill you for a long time later. All of a sudden it just shows up. And so anyway, it was worth doing for sure, and we had a great time. I hope this information has been helpful, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask those in the comments of this video. Our next many videos will be all the awesome adventures that we experienced on this trip, and I'm excited to share it all with you. Make sure to subscribe and change the notification bell to all to ensure you get notified when our next videos publish. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.